One of the ways that SeaTac is trying to overcome this, instead of digital displays, they're using posters in handwriting. It's crazy.
It looks like a school project.
Yeah, what would be the Onion headline? Something along the lines of SeaTac puts out desperate plea for employees who still know how to handwrite. Hi, and welcome to GeekWire. I'm GeekWire co-founder Todd Bishop.
And I'm GeekWire editor Taylor Soper.
We are coming to you from Seattle, where we get to report each day on what's happening around us in business, technology, and innovation. What happens here matters everywhere, and every week on this show, we talk about some of the most interesting stories and trends in the news. Coming up later on, Taylor, I can't help but talk about the SeaTac outage, this massive cyber attack, and how it's sent our major airport in the region back into the dark ages. You've been covering this in and out. We're going to talk about that later on. Plus the reaction to last week's GeekWire podcast and our efforts to find a theme song, a jingle for our My AI segment. I've got a quick update on a few different things that have come to light and that I've been doing since that episode was recorded. But first, Taylor, I want to talk about Brian Niccol, the new Starbucks CEO. We did a special podcast a few weeks ago about the new CEO, the former Chipotle CEO, coming into Starbucks and what it could mean for the company in terms of its attempted turnaround. But you saw a regulatory filing, and this was something that a lot of people picked up on. It was an SEC filing that disclosed Brian Niccol's new salary. And that got a lot of headlines at first, but you picked up on something else. And that was the fact that Brian Niccol is not going to be required to live in Seattle. He's not going to be required technically to treat the Seattle headquarters as his primary office. And in fact, Starbucks said it was establishing a new office in Newport Beach, California, where he currently resides. And in addition to that, they were going to be giving him access to a corporate jet to fly back and forth. What about this initially caught your attention?
Well, for a couple of reasons. The news itself, as we discussed, was surprising. Starbucks has been struggling, but I don't think anyone had Chipotle CEO Brian Niccol on their cards to take over the coffee giant. So that was already surprising. And then when you peruse through this filing, there's the salary numbers, typical. But what popped out was this section titled Remote Office. And as you said, they are opening a new small office for him in sunny Newport Beach, California, hiring an assistant of your choosing for such office, to quote the filing. And the office location will be maintained at the expense of the company, to quote the filing again. So this was interesting in this whole world of remote work and hybrid work, and the fact that Starbucks last year asked employees to come back to the office. Now, these are the corporate employees who work here at the Seattle headquarters, but they asked them to come back 3 days per week. This was a mandate like we're seeing other companies like Amazon do. So when you thought about the mandate and now they hired this new CEO, but he is able to work out of the beach basically, and the employees have to come in, it was notable to say the least.
Yeah, it had the appearance of a double standard. And to me, it was interesting in part because Starbucks reacted somewhat negatively to our initial story pointing this out. And I want to be very clear. You broke this story. You were the one who noticed in the SEC filing that this was going on, while everybody else was focusing on his salary, which is significant. You noticed really the bigger story here, and that was effectively a double standard. Now, Starbucks pushes back. They say that the Seattle headquarters will still be his primary office. He'll exceed the expectations of the company's hybrid work policy, and effectively he'll be there at least 3 days a week, probably more in Seattle. But he'll still have this new office in Newport Beach. And this is interesting for a couple different reasons. First off, Chipotle, after Brian Niccol was hired as CEO there, they announced plans to move their headquarters from Denver to Southern California, to Newport Beach, to where he was based. I don't think that's going to happen in the case of Starbucks. That would be radical to take Starbucks out of Seattle. I don't think the two can ever be separated. We're not going to see a Boeing to Chicago and then beyond kind of move here. Although, I don't know. What do you think? Is that ever something that could happen?
Starbucks to LA. I don't think so. I think Starbucks is going to stay here unless they continue struggling and they need to revert to selling surfboards or something. But no, I think they'll be in Seattle for sure.
Yeah, that would certainly get away from Howard Schultz's vision, I'm sure.
Yeah, I don't know what third place that would be exactly, but yeah, and we should say it's not totally uncommon for a CEO to not work out of the headquarters building 5 days a week. They're traveling all over the world. They're meeting employees. They're going to different offices. Of course, in Starbucks' case, they've got thousands and thousands of stores everywhere across the country and the world. So, of course, he's not going to be in a cubicle every day. I think more broadly, this is more about like the message it sends to not only employees, but now to the rest of the world, customers. I think after my story came out, there has been so much coverage on this between the CNBC, Wall Street Journal. Fast Company did a report and they calculated the carbon emissions that would come from the corporate jet if Nickel commuted once a week from Newport Beach to Seattle. And they said it would emit 1,000 tons of CO2 annually. That's more than 60 times the annual emissions from the average American. So I don't think this is what Starbucks wanted in terms of headlines in the news after they named Brian Niccol as their new CEO. So it's interesting how this story has taken off.
To your point, this is not something that's extraordinary in the world of corporate CEOs. There's other examples, but the carbon emissions was the second shoe to drop in this story. There was a commentary in the Wall Street Journal by two attorneys, Jonathan Berry and Michael Bushbacher, and they said, quote, "We'd like to see him explain to California's dairy farmers, where the latte from the latte comes from, why they should have to install cumbersome and costly anaerobic digesters to manage emissions from cow manure while the new Starbucks CEO jets up and down the West Coast to keep his Newport Beach lifestyle."
That's pretty good. I like the latte on latte.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. So this was really a lightning rod for criticism of the deal and the new CEO. And to your point, though, this is not unusual. And by happenstance, there was a recent profile of Steve Ballmer, the former Microsoft CEO, in Vanity Fair. And it was all about the Clippers' new arena, the Intuit Dome, and Ballmer's ownership of the team and his approach. Great story, by the way. I will link to it from the show notes. But one of the passages was, quote, "The players bear witness to Ballmer's intensity as he attended all but 3 of the Clippers' 41 home games last season, along with a smattering of the team's road games. Ballmer does not own a residence in Los Angeles, but he's been a courtside fixture since buying the team. For most games, he flies in and out on the same day, returning to his home in Bellevue, Washington." And he goes on to explain that his wife, Connie, is a dyed-in-the-wool Northwesterner, and she's not planning to move to Los Angeles, and that's the reason that they have not gotten a place there. But this, to me, was interesting in part because, Ballmer hasn't really been criticized for this, even though it's been public that he makes this kind of commute on his plane from Seattle to LA, the opposite direction.
Yeah, I mean, maybe we should calculate Ballmer's carbon emissions and the impact on the Clippers' win-loss record next year. I feel like this was such a lightning rod because of where we are in 2024 coming out of the pandemic with remote work and hybrid work. And does it matter to be in the office with your colleagues? Does it matter where the CEO or the leader of the team is? Does he or she have to be in the next office over? Can you do everything through Zoom? And does it even matter? I think in a year from now, if Starbucks stock takes off, they've released 2 or 3 amazing new Frappuccinos and they're just flying high. I think everyone's going to forget maybe about this story about where the CEO has a remote office, etc. But it really just speaks to the sensitivity of place and where people are situated and where leaders are, whether it's physical or remote, and just really fascinating. I don't know if we'd had this conversation in 2018, for example.
I was just out at GoDaddy in Kirkland, the domain giant that's getting into all sorts of other types of businesses. I just went out there and visited them a couple weeks ago and sat down and talked with the CEO, Aman Bhutani, who used to be an Expedia executive. And they're technically headquartered in Tempe, Arizona, but he's based in Kirkland, in the Seattle area, the CEO is. And a lot of their key executives are there, although some are in Arizona or other parts of the country. The chief operating officer had just flown in from Singapore. And one of my questions to them was, like, where is the headquarters? It sounds like it's actually in Seattle, not Arizona. And their point to me was, who cares? Why are you asking this question? Because it really doesn't matter anymore. We can be wherever we want, and we can work effectively regardless of our physical location in the world. So a lot of this discussion of headquarters, which is something that we've fixated on over the years quite a bit, in part because that sense of place is so important to the nature of the tech community, to the fabric of the tech community. It seems to be less and less important, and it'll be something that will evolve in the years ahead in some interesting ways, I'm sure.
Maybe other companies will take the route of Zillow and say, we're based in the cloud.
Another recent example, for sure. All right, so that is the story, the update on Brian Niccol, and he hasn't even started in the role yet as CEO. He starts on September 9th. And there's another story that I'll link to that explains he is just jumping right into the fire, whereas his predecessor had a long training period, a long ramp-up period. Brian Niccol is going to be jumping right into it and going full steam ahead on September 9th. So I'm sure there'll be lots more interesting and perhaps substantive angles to cover as he tries to remake Starbucks.
Yeah, I'm fascinated to see what Brian Niccol does. You know, Starbucks has been really struggling in a number of different ways, particularly with their mobile app orders, long lines in the store, whether the Starbucks physical locations are that third place that Howard Schultz pushed forward so hard, or if they're just this pickup, quick digital app type of cafe. What route is Brian Niccol going to take them in, and will it result in more sales, higher stock price? We will see.
Coming up, why they were using pen and paper instead of digital displays at SeaTac Airport this week. Welcome back. It's Todd Bishop with Taylor Soper. You're listening to the GeekWire podcast. Taylor, you've been all over the story of the cyber attack at SeaTac Airport. And this is just astonishing. It's yet another example of how much we are relying on technology as the core infrastructure of so much of what we do. You take away that basic connectivity, the processing, the displays, and it feels like we're being cast back into the dark ages. But before we get to all of that, give us the basics on what we know about the cyber attack at SeaTac Airport, because part of what I understand is we actually don't know a whole heck of a lot here in the middle of the week when we're recording this.
We're recording on Wednesday, and Saturday, so now 4 days ago, the Port of Seattle put out a tweet. They had an internet and web systems outage. Concerning, right? A few hours later, SeaTac Airport, which is operated by the Port of Seattle, said the outage was due to a possible cyber attack. Not good. And it's Wednesday, and to your point, Todd, there has literally been no information shared about what happened, how severe the incident was. All we can tell was this was really bad. Now, the flights themselves and security haven't been impacted, but the baggage services, the digital screens, the lost and found, the in-airport Wi-Fi, all have been down or messed up in some way. And it's scary. It's remarkable. It's, to your point, another example of these cyber attacks that are hitting critical infrastructure and really impacting hundreds, thousands, millions even of people. There haven't even been small improvements to the outage where you might see, okay, the Wi-Fi is back, or hey, our lost and found is working now. It's been just out since Saturday. So this is really not good for the airport.
The Port of Seattle has not said, for example, whether this was a ransomware attack or some other kind of cyber attack, so we don't know exactly the nature of it right now. Just to recap what you're saying there, this is from your coverage over the past few days, just to give folks a sense for the scope of the impact. In-airport Wi-Fi is not working, baggage services are disrupted, some airlines are providing manual bag tags to make up for that. Many TV screens are out, so things like flight info and security wait times are not evident on the screens because they're just not working. The airport's baggage conveyor belt system is affected, which can cause delays in getting luggage to the right plane. The Lost and Found Center is closed, and its Sea Visitor Pass program, which would allow you to go beyond the security gates on sort of a special pass, That's not working. The car parking system is affected. I mean, there is so much that relies on that computer system. And Taylor, just before you jumped on to the podcast, you posted about one of the ways that SeaTac is trying to overcome this, and that is by using literal pen on paper to update folks on where their bags are going. Like, instead of digital displays, they're using posters in handwriting. It's crazy.
It looks like a school project from elementary school or something. It's just...
Yes.
It's funny, but also, as I said before, this is scary, man. Like, between this and last month, there was also an outage. Now, that one, of course, listeners probably know that was the CrowdStrike incident, which was not a cyber attack. But between the cyber attacks, the outages that we're seeing, we rely so much now on the cloud, on technology. And if one thing slips up, or in this case, if it's a massive attack and if it's a ransom that an entity has to pay, or just a huge destruction of a system, it takes days, if not weeks, to get back online. And it really affects so many different things and so many different businesses, government entities. Attacks on ports have been increasing. In fact, the Biden administration earlier this year signed an executive order to increase the cybersecurity of ports around the country. So it's a known fact that these are increasing, yet the hackers are getting better. The AI tools out there are making it easier to infiltrate systems. I don't know where this is going to go, but it doesn't seem good.
In the short term, I think the Labor Day weekend, the holiday coming up with a lot of peak travel coming through the airport, is going to be a real test for the people there and the temporary systems that they've set up. But one of the things that you reported based on your conversations and interactions with cybersecurity experts is that the ports have so much valuable data about people, about processes and logistics, shipping, that it makes them a logical target for this type of thing.
Totally. And it's about profit. If you're not forced to pay a ransom, you're just sitting there having an outage, losing thousands, millions of dollars a day. The economic impact is massive. And I don't know what needs to be done to fix it. Clearly, companies, government entities need to shore up their systems. I spoke with Michael Morgenstern from Dayblink Consulting, and his point was that, yes, the tactics are the same for any other corporate or government entity. You got to build insider threat and supply chain security programs. But his last point was train employees. You know, a lot of these ransomware attacks are the result of an email or even a phone call to an employee, and the hackers are either impersonating someone else, and that all they need is one little opening to get into a system. And so I think we're going to see a lot more sensitivity on, are your workers fully aware of what can happen if you fall for one of these attacks that are getting more and more sophisticated?
All right. Well, we will continue to track this story. Taylor, I know you've been all over it, so be sure to catch up on the latest on this on GeekWire in the coming days. Coming up next, we'll do an update on last week's episode about our quest for an AI theme song. You're listening to GeekWire, and we will be right back. Welcome back. It's Todd Bishop with Taylor Soper. Taylor, last week you and John Cook and I, we used a couple of music services, Suno and Udio, to create a theme song, or to at least look for a theme song for our My AI segment. The reaction to this from a lot of listeners out there was really interesting. First off, when you were able to listen back to the show, did you have any different favorites among the tunes that we played, or any that really got stuck in your ear like an earworm after we recorded the show?
The one we both liked was definitely in my ear. Also in my ear was My AI by John Cook.
Yes.
His jingle is very catchy.
Yes, if only we could import that into the system and have it make it actually musical. Yeah, the one that was very much in the vein of Ariana Grande, I think, really stuck with me, in part because, as I explained on last week's show, it just sounded like the kind of thing that could be a jingle.
In a world of code and screens, where tech is more than just a dream, my AI, the future's here, it's in the sky.
What we heard from a lot of different listeners in reaction to the episode One listener, Fortunato Vega, he posted on LinkedIn and he explained that he was inspired to try one of these text-to-music AI services to create a theme song about his work as a financial advisor.
Fortunato is my name, money is my game. I'm your GPS to life success. Come right with me and you will see how to make money grow from a tree.
I'll link to that from the show notes. Also, thanks to Stephen Johnson, a longtime listener, for his message about the show. I will say, Taylor, after we recorded the episode, as I was writing the post and making additions to it and looking at the RIAA's complaint, the Recording Industry Association of America's complaint against these two services, I really started to have second thoughts about using any of this music. And you know me, I'm pretty liberal with my willingness to try new technology, but some of the legal implications and the fact that this music sounded so much like recognizable artists really gave me pause. And I don't know where this is going to go, but I did get in touch with Daniel L.K. Caldwell, who is the composer, the human composer of the actual GeekWire theme song that you hear at the beginning of the show and in some of the transitions and at the end of the show. And he's listening to the episode, and I'm hoping to get him on for a future episode as a follow-up, just to get his thoughts on all of this as somebody who's steeped in music tradition and would have been the kind of person we would go to for this kind of theme song in the past.
Yeah, I think we discussed this on the show. It's interesting how our sensitivities or perceptions of the content and whether we're more worried about copyright differ based on the type of content, right? Like, I'm wondering if you ask GPT or Claude to write you something and you put that in an email and you feel good about it. Like, oh yeah, that's efficient. But then when you make a song, it's like, oh, this really sounds like Ariana Grande or whoever. And I'm worried about this. Or if it's a photo, I feel like I've been seeing more and more AI produced photos, and those don't seem to cause as much concern about copying someone else's work. But as we see video and other forms of advanced content being made by AI, it's interesting just the reaction and perception from us and humans as to whether, content should be allowed to be out there and whether it violates any laws or ethical rules.
That's a really good point. It really is the medium. Marshall McLuhan would have said that the medium is the message. But in this case, I think each medium carries its own norms, its own standards and practices. And you made the point on the episode that we might be more sensitive as writers to AI-based writing than we might be to music. And I think, though, the similarities are just very hard to overlook when you think about all of these tracks and how much they sound like artists that we all have listened to for years. And I've got to say, we're watching closely the New York Times lawsuit against OpenAI and Microsoft. I think that's going to be a landmark case, especially if it ends up going to trial or reaches a settlement that has some sort of clear conclusion that sets guidelines on these things. In much the same way, the RIAA's lawsuits against Suno and Udio are also going to set some kind of precedent potentially that could determine how we think about or how we treat AI-generated music in the future.
It's all just happening so fast. I mean, we can barely even keep up covering it. I mean, you see this controversial AI bill in California that has divided people in the tech industry and beyond in terms of how do you regulate it, and should it be up to the states, should it be up to the federal authorities, and whether it's copyright or regulation. It just, can we slow down a little bit for the sake of our our job as journalists and just impact on society? But I don't think anything's stopping it. I think it's up to others to catch up and stay up to date. And it kind of speaks to the cybersecurity stuff too. That stuff's just moving so fast. So hopefully maybe we'll use AI to keep up with AI. There you go.
Yes. To quote the great philosopher Lucy from Peanuts, the Charles Schulz classic comic strip, "Stop the world, I want to get off." That's what I grew up with. That's my medium back in the day. All right. Hey, Taylor, thanks for jumping on. This has been great, and appreciate you joining me.
It was a lot of fun. Thanks, Todd.
Thank you for listening. Curt Milton edited this episode. Our theme music is by Daniel L.K. Caldwell. With GeekWire editor Taylor Soper, I'm GeekWire co-founder Todd Bishop. We'll be back soon with a new episode of the GeekWire podcast.